good news about the newsstands, and we lost like half of the circulation on the newsstands in the last 10 years. Now we are going to hear the better news. How can we reverse that trend? What can we do that we can actually sell more copies on the newsstands? And the key word in this experience that we've heard so much is data, data, data. So the question is, what do we do with this data? Well, today we have two friends that decided they are going to use the ACT experience as the place to release their new information and as the place that will show you what they have been working on. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Gil Brechtel. Said it right. I've been training to pronounce like German names. And Joshua Gary, who are going to take us through their latest work on the newsstand single copy data, and to present to us like what hopefully will be a new tool that our industry will be using and to help us improve the single copy sales. So Gil, Joshua.
Good morning. I want to, again, thank Samir for inviting us here today. I spoke at last year's Act 5 conference as well and truly enjoyed it. As Samir and John both stated, Magnet is involved in the newsstand business. And after listening to Vanessa and Michael and Billy and Roy talk about their evolving businesses and how exciting it is now to deliver content to their customers across multiple platforms, and the events they have and how they're engaging customers and how they're trying to build their audience. Newsstand kind of reminds me of a quote I heard several years ago that kind of goes like this. Did you ever realize the world was a tuxedo and you're a pair of old brown shoes? And while newsstand is a pair of old brown shoes, it's an important pair of old brown shoes. I think newsstand sales for most publishers is still very profitable. And I also think newsstand sales indicates the viability and vitality of magazine covers or magazine titles now into the future. So what we're going to do this morning is I'm just going to introduce our company and introduce our presentation. I'm going to turn it over to my young and much smarter colleague, Josh Gary, who's going to take you through it. So our presentation this morning is going to focus on covers and what we believe cover treatment can do for increased sales at newsstand. If we get through that, then Josh is going to talk about some other topics that we believe are happening in newsstand today and trends that are happening that make sense and you guys should be aware of. So first of all, just an overview of our company and what we do. Magazine Information Network, or Magnet, was formed in the year 2000. We're owned by the U.S. wholesalers. Anybody that's affected or on the newsstand understands or would understand that our business was put into turmoil at the end of May of this year when Source Interlink Media, the second largest wholesaler with a market share of about 30%, went out of business on one Friday afternoon. And the industry is just starting to really get back to normal. So currently, the way we see the market share working out is the three major wholesalers, which would be the News Group, Hudson News, and Ingram, will represent about 92% of the market, with a whole bunch of, let's say, 30 or so smaller wholesalers picking up the other 8% of the market. So a lot of concentration at the three largest wholesalers. What Magnet does is, because we are owned by the wholesalers, we capture all of the US and Canadian wholesalers' information down to the store level, the allocation, the returns, and the sales. And we capture that for about 8,000 titles over about 150,000 retailers. And we capture that information at least once a week and many times 3 to 4 times a week. So the data that we receive is very, very timely. We also receive directly from retailers or from wholesalers point of sale data from chains that represent about 50% of the retail market in the US. Chains like Barnes & Noble and Kroger and Safeway and Costco, et cetera, send us their data, and we use that really for a bunch of different reasons, including just trending, how individual titles and issues are doing. We get a very quick read of it, and we provide that information to some of our clients. What Magnet does is capture all of this data and sell it on behalf of the wholesalers to publishers and national distributors. We also provide consultancy services for publishers all the way down to doing their distributions at the store level, working with our wholesaler owners. And I would say that Magnet is recognized as the newsstand industry's central data repository. Anybody that wants any information regarding newsstand comes to Magnet. And one of the things that we do capture in what we call our Newsstand Industry Resource Center is covers. We scan every issue of the cover of every issue of about 4,000 magazines. So we have this huge database of covers. And not only do we scan them, but we index the sales against previous issues of the same magazines. And we also catalog the covers according to cover treatment. Could be personality, or it just could be cover treatment such as cakes and pies and whatever. So that's kind of what Magnet does. So obviously, we're interested, and we think we know what drives newsstand sales. You know, I was a wholesaler for a lot of years, and my good friend Bruce Sherbo, who's in the audience, was also a wholesaler. And I can't tell you over the years of being a wholesaler how many meetings I had with publishers who came to me and said, you know, on that last issue of this magazine, your people did a horrible job. And I said, why? He said, well, because the sales are down. You obviously must have did something wrong. And I would say, but look at the next issue, where the sales really did well. So that means we did a better job on that issue and a worse job on a previous issue. I said, we may not be good or we may not be bad, but we're consistent. So it's not really what the wholesalers do. Now, understanding when Source went out of business, there was a disruption, and that certainly affected sales. But really, what drives magazine or newsstand sales is cover treatment. It's really the cover treatment of these magazines that drives sales. And I would venture to say that it's only on the newsstand where covers are relevant. If you're getting 52 issues through a subscription of People magazine or Sports Illustrated, who really cares what the cover looks like? But what happens on the newsstand is basically the consumer, because most of our sales come through checkouts, the consumer only has about 30 seconds to make a decision on whether or not they want to buy that magazine. And what's happening now in today's world is retailers, especially like Kroger, they're using technology to quicken the pace of their consumers or their customers going through the checkout lanes. So there's even less time now than there used to be for a consumer to decide whether or not that cover treatment jumps out at them enough in order to buy the magazine. So what we've seen in our analysis is that there's really a large variance, sales variance, between issues to issues on these newsstand sales. And we believe, again, because wholesaler service is consistent, we believe the major factor in why sales are either good at the newsstand or bad at the newsstand is because of the cover treatment. And just to show you some huge swings in sales, and ironically, Michael Clinton, if you were there last night, used exactly these same two covers, which is surprising to me. What he didn't, and he showed, and the audience was right in suggesting that Miranda Kerr cover treatment was a lot worse than Kim Kardashian. And that's true. But what he didn't say is there was a swing of over 500,000 units sold between those two covers. Now think about that. Certainly Kim Kardashian was very profitable at the newsstand for Hearst, but not the Miranda Kerr cover. So cover treatment is very, very, very important. Here's some other ones. Again, the best issue and the worst issue of Family Circle, nearly 300,000 copies difference. And if you're working from a 620,000 base, that's about a 50% difference in sales. Huge. People magazine has done a very, very good job, especially recently, beating everybody else to the punch on these timely celebrity titles. And while the cover on the left, this cover about the 3 young ladies who were kidnapped and kept in Ohio, I thought would have been timely. It came out about 2 or 3 weeks after the fact. And it did very, very poorly. I mean, People magazine was averaging about 850,000, 900,000 copies per issue sale on a newsstand. That one only did about 560,000. But then you look at the Royal Baby issue, and again, that did 1,000,001, or 440,000 copies better than the worst issue of the year. Then you look at Women's Day, the same thing, 295,000 copies on a base of 600, so another about a 50% difference between the worst cover of the year and the best cover of the year. So what does it all mean? I mean, I think what we see is that the volatility of newsstand sales from issue to issue puts a lot of burden on publishers for a lot of reasons. One, obviously, you don't want any stinkers. You don't want any issues that are going to lose you money. Two, when you're trying to normalize your distribution down to the store level, because the wholesalers' computer systems take the best issues and the worst issues and average them out, having a really bad issue is going to affect the draw on future issues, which is not good. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and he's going to take you from here. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? All right. Can we hear me in the back? I normally don't have a problem with speaking or screaming because I've got 4 kids and I scream at them across the house all day, so even if this didn't work, we'd be all right. So I think that's sort of a good segue in from Gil because, quite honestly, there's certainly a lot of turmoil in the newsstand, but a lot of it can actually be affected. And I think that's one of the messages that we want to try to drive home today is that in the publishing world, it's not something where you have to just accept that there's these swings. There's actually some predictability that you can create from it, because I think what you'll find is that part of the problem is not necessarily just that there's a swing in newsstand sales, but it's how do you know it's coming? What can you do to deflect it? What can you do to minimize the stinkers? And what can you do to maximize the royal babies? I'm going to start out by showing you a cover that it's really just kind of timely because there's a lot of things that we can do to drive interest on the newsstand. And I have a couple of magazines here. I need them all back, but you can obviously take a look at them to try to drive people. If, as Gil said, you have 30 seconds, potentially up to try to get a consumer's attention to buy your magazine, pay $5, $6, $7, $10, $15 for the magazine. What can you do? And I thought this particular one was an incredible example of what you can do, and I just got it last week. Can everybody see what this is? It's a 3D cover. It's a holograph. If you're passing by the newsstand, you can take a look at this when you go to here. If you look at this, there is absolutely no way you can miss this if you're staring at the newsstand. So if you're potentially going to be interested in biking or bicycles and BMX or racing or downhill, you are absolutely going to have your eyes on this magazine. And I don't really have to explain why. This is pretty much self-explanatory. Anyway, feel free to take a look at it. Just don't swipe it from me because I only have one. So what does this mean? It means we still have the opportunity to affect success. So I'm going to just pass through a little bit. So when they have these sort of volatile issues and these volatile moments with with sales, it affects everybody within a publishing house. From the consumer marketing group who's trying to figure out, well, do I need to substitute some of these newsstand sales for sales in other channels and so forth and so on. You have folks that are in the newsstand distribution world who are saying the volatility is very difficult to manage because, as Gil said, there's a lot of consistency within the wholesale channel regarding how copies are distributed. So trying to figure out which one is going to sell very well and which one is not, and how to be able to react to that is very complicated. And then from the editorial side, you think about the editor, they're constantly trying to figure out who is my audience today, how do I find them today, how do I engage them today, how do I deliver content to them today that is interesting to them and that on the newsstand they're willing to pay for. And that's what makes newsstands such an interesting phenomenon, because what you end up finding is that the best indicator for the success of content is really at the newsstand. Because you have to actually get somebody to take $10, $15 of their hard-earned money and give it to you to take that magazine home. So from an editorial perspective, when they're sitting there trying to figure out who are my consumers, how do I reach them, and how do I do it on a consistent basis, the cover makes a big difference. So from our perspective, we like to try to spend a lot of time understanding what's actually happening on the cover of a magazine so that we can deliver the analyses that are actionable to a publisher to go back and say, here's what you did, here's what you didn't do, here's what was successful, and here is what wasn't. So, and I think what you end up finding is that there's a lot of things that you can do from a publisher's perspective to try to help the sales of your magazine. These are just some examples. The most important one for us today is really what's on the cover. Now, certainly you can look at the placement. Do I want to be at the front of the store, the back of the store, the bottom rack, the top rack? There's a whole bunch of factors. Do I change my pricing model? Is it too expensive? Is it too cheap? And so forth and so on. Today's focus is specifically on the product. And when you sort of think about covers and the analyses of covers, one of the things that we constantly think about is, I already know this. I know who my consumer is. I know who exactly buys this magazine. I know that it's the guy who does the BMX bike races on the weekend, and it's the father of the child who goes to the biking events. Well, I'll tell you one of the dirty little secrets. If your name is Hearst, Condé, Time Inc., and a few others, you probably do. If your name is not, you probably don't. And that's one of the most interesting things that if you talk to some of the editors that we talk to and we go, listen, there's a lot of things that are happening on your cover that you probably don't know about. And they go, forget about it. And they start to walk away. And then I start to tell them what it is. And they go, what? What was that? And then they start to realize that there's a lot more going on beneath the surface that we can help them with. And then the second dirty little secret that I like to sort of talk about is that success on covers is not always about what you do, but what you also don't do. Sometimes it's trying to avoid the disaster, because what you'll find is that if you can have consistent sales throughout the year, one or two great successes, and then avoid the disaster, that could make the difference between a profitable year and an unprofitable year. So sometimes understanding the success and failures of covers will help you not only in deciding, all right, I want to put Kim Kardashian or Miranda Kerr or whatever it might be on the cover, but helping you to remember, oh yeah, don't do that, right? Don't forget, I don't want a dark background if it's the summertime. Light backgrounds, summertime, and so forth and so on. So sometimes, again, the point is it's not always about what it is that you put on the cover, but also potentially what you don't. And from our perspective, the focus is really on the data. It's about understanding what data is available to us, how to make it relevant to the user and to the publisher, and then how to make it actionable, because ideally you don't just stare at some information, you look at the reports, you say they're pretty, it's a beautiful chart, then you go home and you go to sleep. The concept is, how do I actually use this to make an effect in my business? So we have a cover analyzer tool that we use. We also like to do exploratory analysis, which is basically just a deeper dive into the actual numbers, which we'll get to in a second. And then once you've sort of understood who your consumer is at a much more granular level, test. There's a sort of a long-standing notion within Newsstand that you really can't test, and I'm here to tell you that's just not true. Number one, because it's not true, and number two, because we test a lot. And so what you'll find is that once you understand who your consumer is better, you can actually do things to change potentially the pricing, the distribution model, a cover in the East, a cover in the West, things like that. So I'm going to give you sort of a quick introduction to a cover analyzer system that we have internally, and just then actually dive into a demonstration of it, just because I like to actually show you things, because I think sometimes people can stare at a PowerPoint presentation and they can just kind of get zoned out. But when you're actually sitting there and looking at the live system, it gets fun. Interestingly, we were at a conference last week, and a guy got up on the stage and he says, "I don't have any PowerPoints for you. I don't have any videos, so you're just going to have to hear the smooth sound of my voice for an hour." I swear in 5 minutes, nobody was awake. So anyway, the cover analysis system that we use is really mostly for title trending, for reviewing of the content. As Gil said, we have about 4,000 magazines a month that we scan, and it can be used by a variety of folks within the shop. So before I do this, though, I just updated my presentation because I want to talk about a particular cover that was mentioned in passing this morning by Vanessa, and I want to show it to you because it sort of epitomizes a lot of the things that we talk about and think about. And this is the cover that Vanessa mentioned this morning, the Maya Angelou special. And I just want you to kind of think about this and stare at it for just a second. You've got a picture that sort of shows who this person is. It shows you the depth. It shows you her power. It shows you her personality. It is the essence of who she was. So as you stare at that image, a perfectly created cover, there's thousands and thousands of of images that they could have selected from, and I think this was a perfect selection. Black and white with just a touch of color, not just any color, a particular color that they know resonates with their user, with their consumer, and then in the top left corner, reminding you its essence. Because you bring those things together, and that lends you that credibility of not only this is a great picture, but when you see that word essence, you know what you're going to find inside is quality. So, and I just thought it was really timely, so I thought I would bring it up here because I actually think that it's a perfect example of how to create a magazine cover. And if there are any students in this room, if you have an opportunity to say hi to Vanessa, get yourself a job right now. And then there's one more, and I'm going to show you one more cover. And it was actually really timely from Rodale just a few minutes ago because we have this kind of concept of power. And power drives people. Power drives consumption at retail. When you just have a few seconds to think about whether you want to buy this, the very first amputee to be shown on the cover of Men's Health. Huge, huge, powerful image. I think on the Facebook page that you saw a few minutes ago, it was sort of introduced very quickly, but this is the cover, and it really is spectacular. All right, so let's go into... I actually do. I actually expect that, yes. Awesome. Yep, yes. All right, so I want to take you through our cover analyzer system because just for a couple of minutes, just because it's sort of, number one, it breaks up the presentation and not just listening to me talk and looking at slides, but also because, assuming everything runs fine. Yay, okay. So let me make that a little bit smaller if I can. Edit, view, zoom, zoom out. There we go. So in our cover analyzer system, the whole point here is to kind of be able to dive into the data at a deeper level than you normally would, and then try to make some inferences from that. From there, we would drive into our exploratory analysis, which gets down to a very, very, very granular level. So I'm going to pick a magazine just because it's fun this way, and because it's timely. I'm going to look at some covers of Men's Health. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to show you very quickly what you can do with this. And then I'm going to come back and run one more example, and then we'll move on, because I got a ton to talk about and limited time. So what happens is in the system, it has all of the sales, the US and Canadian magazine sales for every issue of every magazine in the country that's distributed out there, and then associated covers. As Gil said, we index them against their own prior history and put it back up to the user. And so what you basically get here is an example. Let me make it a little bit smaller again. There we go, zoom out, perfect. There we go. And what you get is sort of an understanding of what works and what doesn't work very, very quickly when you actually look at the index. So the index, black, upward arrows is good, down red arrows is bad, against its own history over the past 3 months, 6 months, year. And then another very, very important indicator is how did it do against last year? Because magazines especially that have a consistent distribution year over year, it's not necessarily the most important thing to get your best issue of the year from every release, but it's more about understanding how did I do comparatively over time. So this is just generally speaking how it works. And obviously behind it, we scan at a very, very high resolution. So you can come in here and you can click and you can get a high res image of the cover in case you want to look at somebody else's abs much more closely. So I guess if it was me, I don't know, Men's Health isn't my choice, but. All right. And then, so the whole point would be, all right, so I get it, Josh. This is just really simple. There's some covers and there's some sales information, and I can look at it and go, yes, this cover was successful, and that wasn't, yay, whoop-de-doo. Well, I think more interestingly than that is what you find when you dig one level deeper. And as an example, one of the things that we'll do as we dig one level deeper, if the screen will actually come back to me, is what we're going to do is we're going to go into some of the content search. So part of the cover system allows the user to look at the actual cover of a magazine and then search by keywords. Because what you're going to find is that there's actually a trend. There could be based on searching for the word gluten or gluten-free or games or Nintendo or PS3 or whatever it might be. So what we can actually do is go in here and we can say, assuming my performance continues to hopefully get better. I don't know what's going on today. So, and then what we can actually do is we can go into the cover and we can say, what was the words that were actually used on this cover, and then line up all of the titles next to each other and say, look at that. I've got 7 titles in a row that are performing well above what they should, and all of them happen to use the word cranberry on them. And by the way, they're all cooking books, et cetera, et cetera. If this doesn't go, I'm just going to give up in a second for whatever reason. Looks like well, one more second, just as I was about to give up. So we can come in here. And what we can do is, and I'll continue to talk as this goes through, we can actually just type in the words gluten, and where we can type in the word free, and tell me where I have both gluten and free showing up anywhere on the cover of the magazine. And then it gets much more interesting because what you end up finding is that there's trends. And then once you find those trends, you want to understand at a more granular level down from here. So it sort of starts out at going, how do I look at my magazine sales as a whole? How do I look at specific covers? And then how do I get even more granular to specific colors, specific titles, specific blurbs, specific personalities? So we'll give it one more second and then we'll move on. No, yes, maybe so. Nah. What's that? No, I'm not. I took out Men's Health. I'm just looking at it across all of our magazines. Yeah, exactly. So then what ends up happening is you end up finding all of these covers are using the word gluten and the word free in there. And you think, well, Vogue? Yeah, it's actually on the cover. It's actually on the cover of First Magazine. And then you start to realize that maybe some of these topics actually cross over editorial categories. And then you go, well, I could never do a gluten cover. Why not? Why not? Because you can look at the success over here and you can go, yes, it was done several times. And you can see the time of the year. You can see how successful it became. You can see this issue of Self. Now, is it just because of gluten-free that Self magazine had a success on this issue? 8% over last year, 35% over their normal national average. It's part of it. And then what we like to do, once we've identified that this is potentially a very successful cover and it has the words gluten-free on it, is that we're going to go down to another level of detail, which I'm going to show you as well. So that's just sort of how the cover analyzer system works. And moving on. Pop question, pop quiz, trick question, just so you know. It's a very trick question. Which is better? The cover on the left that had 5280 in April of this year, sold 16,500 copies, or the cover on the right, which is the June 2013 issue, who says the cover on the left is a better cover, or better seller? Better seller, better overall. Which is better, left or right? Left, why?
Because in the industry in general, sales are down 10% year over year, every year, basically.
That's absolutely correct. And I think I'll take it another step further. Success is not necessarily defined exclusively by the sales of the magazine. So now I'll put this piece up and say which one is better. If you normally sell, call it 7, 8, 9,000 an issue in April of every single year, and then one year you hit 16.5, that's a huge success. And that's something that you learn from. And then you start to realize it's the time of year, it's the color, it's the background, it's what resonates with your folks, it's who's traveling to Colorado at this point of year, and so forth and so on. So the whole point of the exercise and what I'm trying to illustrate is that success is not necessarily only defined by whether or not June sold better than July or July sold better than August. There's a variety of different metrics of success that we like to apply. And that kind of brings us to our next level of detail, which is what we call the exploratory data analysis. Going to share with you a real live example of things that we do at Magnet to sort of dive into the details and the opportunities on magazine titles. So we took 5 magazines that are listed up on the board. Maybe you've heard of one or two of them. And we looked at every single issue of every single one of these magazines done by a colleague of ours named Magerko, who you might have heard of. And he spent some time looking at these magazines. And we spent a lot of time sort of diving into what is it that drives the cover of the magazine. And depending on who you ask, you're going to potentially get 50, 60, 100 different potential things that drive a cover. And we tried to isolate them and put them into sort of subgroups. Things such as the logo color, the background color, the person on the cover, obviously the celebrity matters, the timing of that celebrity. Justin Bieber, I will tell you, not that I'm a huge Justin Bieber fan, but he was fantastic on magazines until a day that he just completely died. He got caught in Miami with some BS or whatnot and got in trouble in Miami. Up until then, he was a sure shot. After that, I don't care what magazine it is. It could be on Teeny Bopper or anything else. He died. So it's not only the person, but another thing that we find is that from trying to figure out who the consumer is that's picking up this magazine, what the age of that person is, and what the age of the celebrity is that you're displaying on that cover matters. So much so that, that Bauer decided to launch a title called Closer, which is specifically focused on the older celebrities because they realized there's a market that they were trying to find. So not only is it Johnny Depp, but what age is Johnny Depp, man or woman? How many blurbs are there? The size of the blurbs? Are there any other attributes of the cover? And then we try to tag them. And then once we tag them, and like we said, we looked at 2 years worth of history, so you're looking at about 100 issues of all of these different magazines. We put them through a statistical modeling tool that we have called SPSS. If anyone does any type of statistical modeling, it's one of the most famous ones out there. And then we basically try to categorize the results. And the results basically help us understand what's a waste of time, what doesn't affect your sale, and what's actually valuable information. And here are some of the items that we find. The number of people that are on the cover, doesn't really matter. The logo matters. The color of the logo matters. The age of the celebrity, not so much. So when you start to dive into some of these details and you start to think about what it is that's actually driving the cover sales, from here you can then use this information to not only determine what you're going to do next, but also to help you avoid that disaster. Because what you'll find is that if you look at all the celebrity covers, there are certain cases where if you just avoid, for example, if you look at the sales by the media platform, they all look very similar. And then if you look at the age of the celebrity, the older celebrities index better across all the magazines. That will help you. The older celebrities are the ones that people are picking up more often, which is perfectly fine and understandable. So again, the whole point is for every one of the titles that are out there, they can be looked at a little bit differently, but the general concept is the same, which is if you take a look at the covers, you start to decompose what they're actually made of, then you put them through a modeling tool which helps you understand what's relevant and what isn't, and then you come up with your results, and then you use them, and then after that, you test. Because then from here you go, okay, well, that all sounds great, Josh, but how does it work in practice? Well, and that's what we go in and actually make tests in practice, and Magnet actually helps publishers do that in practice and play. So, and here's an example. So, if I told you that you know, Kim Kardashian is hot across the country, most people would say that's great, but it's not necessarily 100% correct. She's hot across most of the country, and if you can create 2 covers, which a lot of publishers can. It costs a little bit of money, but in the grand scheme of things, the amount of money that you stand to lose by putting a Kim Kardashian in the South is significant enough where the extra cost for creating 2 covers is really sort of you know, an irrelevant amount of money compared to what you gain by putting out a cover that's specifically tailored towards the demographics that you're going for. And once you understand who your consumers are, where they live, who they are as far as what their buying habits are, what they like to do, what kind of car they drive, and we have a lot of that information, you can start to tailor your offering to them, not necessarily just putting out one cover across the country, but just saying, if I know that there's the Country Music Awards and I know that Miranda Lambert is popular, then I'm going to put a cover specifically tailored towards the Southeast. And it can be done, and it is done. So we go back to testing and retesting. One of the things that sort of irks me in this business is that there's this constant discussion about incremental sale, that magazine sales can only kind of be moved this just sort of minimal amount, that you really can't move the needle significantly, and I would basically tell you that's hogwash. There is absolutely no reason why major brands, major publications, major publishers couldn't move the needle significantly by really understanding who their consumer is, how to find them, how to continue to track them as they move along, because as the technology changes, the consumer is obviously on the go. This is an example very quickly of how we actually analyze some of the sales results. So we actually have a lot of point of sale data, which Gil was mentioning earlier, which helps us understand very, very quickly whether or not you're having success. If you are, then we can try to tailor the next issue based on the success or failure of your of cover A. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of things that we're seeing in the industry, just cover-wise. One of them, obviously, in that decline example, but I'm also going to give you another example. This is a magazine. It's, I wouldn't say my personal favorite, but it's one that seems to be resonating with users. It's called Recoil. Has anyone seen this one before? No? So Recoil is what I would call an outdoor recreation enthusiast type of magazine, and it sort of has a kind of a rough, manly feel to it. One of the things that you see on a lot of covers right now is there's a focus on texture. And if you want to come up and touch this magazine, you're more than welcome to. And you'll see that it's actually kind of coming off the page. It's got a very strong texture to it, and they're continuing to make it rougher as they go, because the roughness is part of the magazine content, and now they've made roughness part of the experience of owning this magazine. It's not just what you read and what senses are ignited by looking at the pictures in the magazine, but it's actually how it feels in your hand, and it sort of adds to that experience. So you're more than welcome to look at this one. So textured covers is something that we're seeing a lot of. The 3D holograph, and then rubberized. So the Pro Cycling magazine, if you've ever seen one before, it actually sort of feels like rubber. And it actually adds to that experience because they're bicycle riders, and so it's actually really interesting. Yeah, it is. If you ever get your hands on it, it's kind of odd. It almost feels like you're touching a bicycle tire. It does. The other thing that we're seeing topically is we're seeing added value being given to the consumer. So not just telling the consumer, I want you to look at my magazine for 7.5 seconds and then give me $12 for it, but actually trying to make it more value to them. So you'll see a lot of poly bags, which is basically situations where publishers will put 2 or 3 magazines together, they'll wrap it up, and they'll put a little higher of a price. The poly bag situation from Hearst, in this case, there were 3 magazines. Car and Driver was in the front, and it was listed at $11. They sold 70%. Which, if you don't know the trends in the business at around an average of around 30%, this 70% is just phenomenal. And then added value, so Uncut Magazine, which is a music title out of London, so they add a CD with music that's tied to the person on the cover, or has some relationship to the cover in every issue. So again, trying to drive value for the consumer, so it's not just look at my magazine for 7 seconds and pick it up. I've seen samples of creams and other things like that. We saw, I think it was last night, they were discussing the vial of fragrances that we saw in the insert there. And then another thing that I wanted to sort of mention, just because it's of interest to me, because it seems to be coming back, is games. So games is a topic or an editorial category that seems to be coming back, and I brought some sort of gaming examples with me. So there's a whole bunch of video games that are becoming popular again. Here's this new Destiny game, and there's another one called Call of Duty, whatever, if you like Call of Duty. One of the things that I think is interesting about the gaming category is that the focus is now no longer just on finding the 16-year-old who happens to play Nintendo and they want to get the secrets to Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. that's not why they buy the magazine anymore. Now you're talking about adult professionals who are making a hobby and have actually a lifestyle associated with playing games. And they're doing it online, they're doing it on PC, they're doing it in a whole bunch of places. And this is actually geared towards them. They're not looking for 15-year-olds anymore. They're looking for 35-year-olds. So anyway, this is another phenomena that we're seeing with a lot of different games that are coming out. It also sort of illustrates that there's a lot of things that are happening in the gaming world that are specifically tied to a game. It's not that you're finding that there are these broad spectrum of this is a gaming magazine like you used to have. This is Halo. If you like Halo, this is for you. See? So, and that kind of leads into a conversation about bookazines, which if some of you are familiar with the concept of bookazines, which are this sort of high-priced, very niche content magazines that are created, and they're generally sold at a very high cover price, and they have a significant effect on the overall sales within the US and Canadian market. They've been pretty flat for a while, probably somewhere around 15% of all magazines sold are bookazines. But what we're finding is that there's almost like an overdose, because now that publishers are seeing the potential success by really diving in and understanding who the consumer is and then driving a magazine specifically towards that person, it's flooding the market. It really absolutely is flooding the market. And there's a lot of Me Too guys out there. And they're charging $10, $11, and it sort of dilutes what you find on the newsstand. So what we want to try to emphasize is focusing on the quality of the product versus just putting out more and more bookazines. And then, quite honestly, not every topic has an audience that you can charge over $10 for. And what you'll find is that there's publishers that we talk to that say, I want to make bookazines. That's great. What kind of content do you have? Well, I deal with Montana quilters. I don't think you're going to get a national magazine out of that. So there are some times where you just have to try to avoid those disasters by understanding who the consumers are and then try to figure it out from there. I took the liberty of adding a couple of covers of magazines that maybe don't have a wide enough audience to cover spending $10, and the sales they show it. And I'm sort of happy, especially about the one in the middle, because if America decided that women's shoes was really worth paying $10 for every time, we're in big trouble as a country. And with that, are there any questions? Yes, sir.
On the celebrities, is there any way that you sort of try to quantify, like what I'm really thinking of is like Q scores or something like that, where you say, if this person has a certain quantifiable impact on this demographic?
Yes, yeah, so does a person, the question is, does an individual personality have a quantifiable impact broken out, not nationally, but by a certain demography? And the answer is absolutely. So we collect all of the demographic data from Nielsen as it relates to who the consumers are at individual locations around the country, and then we can slice up the personalities. I will tell you, though, that personalities does not cross editorial categories very well. So what works for one magazine doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for the other, but the answer is effectively yes.
Why would you compare a magazine in June against a magazine at Christmas time? Why wouldn't you compare June to June?
You actually do. As a matter of fact, the example that I showed with 5280 is compared against what it did last year. So you're actually illustrating the exact point is, and if you look at the cover on the left from 5280, I think I had it was 64% index. That's actually over last year, because that's what's showing you that consumer demand is traditionally X, but this year it's 64% higher because of that cover that you put out.
Have you ever had a January issue do as well as a December issue?
In that particular magazine, I haven't looked, but we certainly could.
Yeah, we have time for one more question.
Yes, sir.
Because earlier you had several covers, Hugh Jackman, Matt Damon, Tom Brady, and some other fellow.
You remember all them very well.
Yeah. Why did Tom Brady underperform compared to the others? I mean, he was all red, where the others had mostly black.
Well, I think it would be an interesting exercise to pull up all the covers from Tom Brady and see whether or not it's consistent or if it's just something specifically to him. I would also argue that on Men's Health, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is he wearing a shirt?
And he was wearing a jacket. That's what I noticed. Everybody was wearing an undershirt except him wearing a jacket.
Right. And Tom, yeah, exactly. And I think that what we're trying to say is that any one cover, that's what you're sort of alluding to is exactly what we like to do, which is to try to dive into the one and then go, well, can we make a case by looking at other magazines where they have a similar set of characteristics? Can we actually make that case that not only Tom Brady did poorly on Men's Health, but Tom Brady did poorly 10 times over. So if you're considering bringing him in for your next cover shoot, you should think again. Maybe bring in Giselle.
Well, the other thing is, everybody in New England is wondering why Tom Brady's been underperforming.
That's out of my area of expertise.
Well, thank you very much. And again, I mean, I've been publishing on my blog, on the Mr. Magazine, interviews with Magnite about this new tool. And I think, it's amazing if we really start thinking, how can we put the data into practice? I mean, it's one thing to collect all the data. It's another thing to put the data into practice. And I think that's what the future holds for us. Thank you, Josh.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill.